We all have that friend that recommends a restaurant that for whatever reason you're hesitant to try, only to finally give in and then be very annoyed with yourself for waiting because it was amazing. Final Fantasy V is a restaurant that Squaresoft tried to get me to eat at back in 1999, when the Final Fantasy Anthologies title was released for the original PlayStation that contained both Final Fantasy V and VI. It wouldn't be for another 20 or so years before I finally tried that restaurant, and let me tell you what, it was damn delicious. Final Fantasy V was released originally only in Japan on December 6th of 1992. As we've discussed in the review of Final Fantasy IV and Mystic Quest, Square was still having trouble breaking into the US market. With Mystic Quest releasing just a couple of months prior to 5, Square believed that the interest just wasn't there in the West. The sales numbers of Final Fantasy IV and Mystic Quest did little to change their perception. Interestingly, Square did originally plan to bring Final Fantasy V to North America as Final Fantasy III, but the project fell through. With 4 being considered too difficult and with additional mechanics coming to 5, Square felt that it would be far too much for the West to wrap its head around. They also toyed with the idea of releasing Final Fantasy V in the West as a standalone game, and separating the poor performance of the Final Fantasy series in the West. Final Fantasy V had 2 more attempts to get a project localized for the West during the next 6 years, including a PC port from both Eidos and Top Dog Software, but these were also cancelled. It wouldn't be until 1999 that the port would finally be released on the PlayStation in the Final Fantasy Anthology Collection that included both Final Fantasy V and Final Fantasy VI. The anthology included updated features, 2 fully rendered CGI cutscenes, a memo save system, and a bestiary. Yet in the Western market, they would see similar sales figures to Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. Final Fantasy V is a very unique entry, not only for the game itself, but it is one of the few games that I remember being passed around a lot as computer emulation started to rise up in the late 1990s and early 2000s. I had purchased the anthology version when it came out for Final Fantasy VI, and I did play through that again. But by the time that the anthology was released, Final Fantasy VII was already out, and 8 was on the horizon, so after a short time with Final Fantasy V, I had quit my playthrough prematurely. Now before we get into the advanced systems and strategy brought into Final Fantasy V, let us discuss the story for a moment. Although I will not be going crazily in depth on the story, there are some specifics that I will address that would be considered spoilers. So fast forward to this timestamp if you wish to avoid anything story related. So the game starts with you playing as Butz. Well, that is if you're playing the fan translation, or more canonically known as Bartz, as some random dude sitting at a campfire with a chocobo. After the events of the prologue, the game really starts when you arrive at the Wind Shrine and get your first taste of the awesomeness to come. Jobs. Now I will discuss jobs and how awesome they are in a moment, but in an effort to consolidate the story portion of this review, I'm going to go ahead and put a pin in that for now. The game has a simple loop for a good portion of it. Move to a new area, find the crystal that is waning in its stability, the crystal explodes, collect shards to become stronger, and add to your LinkedIn-sized pool of jobs. One of the big moments in the story that I wanted to discuss is a particular scene with 𝐂𝐓, who is the 4th character the player recruits. 𝐂𝐓, in an act of heroism to protect his friends and loved ones, sacrifices himself at the hands of the main antagonist Exdeath. Unlike in previous entries where the cast is constantly revolving, 𝐂𝐓 by this point had been traveling with the party for quite some time, so his death could come as quite the shock. All of 𝐂𝐓's XP levels, job levels, and equipment are gone in an instant. Well, that is until his granddaughter 𝐂𝐓 takes all of his abilities and XP, so the real impact of the party is really just a different sprite. Now, I'm not saying that it wouldn't have sucked to lose 𝐂𝐓 permanently, along with all the progress that you made with him, kind of like a certain flower girl in a different Final Fantasy, but the fact that 𝐂𝐓 obtains these abilities while 𝐂𝐓's body is still warm really deflates the impact that this moment could have had. In my opinion, the story of Final Fantasy V is the one thing that holds it back from being everything that I could have ever wanted out of this era of JRPGs. The gameplay, strategy, presentation, secrets, and endgame are unparalleled until the PlayStation era. But the characters and story just didn't grip me nearly as much as Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy IV. Now, had I played 5 before 6 and been allowed to build that nostalgia, perhaps I might feel differently. Just like Final Fantasy III, in Final Fantasy V, the job system has returned and been refined, improving on the original idea. They keep the familiar job structure we know, with classes like the Knight, Thief, Black Mage, and so on. But now, as you master the different specific abilities of each job, you can keep those abilities as you change jobs throughout the game. Do you want a Black Mage that can also cast time magic? Go for it! Or maybe you would like a two-handed sword-wielding Mystic Knight to decimate your enemies with a flare-imbued Excalibur. Now this is where Final Fantasy V really shines. The versatility of this job system takes everything that made Final Fantasy III great and improves upon it in every way. As you master classes, you will earn stat bonuses that will also be applied to the freelancer job. At the end of the game, you can go back to the freelancer job, now able to equip all the different types of weapons and armor, take any 2 mastered job abilities, and gain the boosted stats from all of the jobs that you had previously maximized. This feels amazing. It rewards the player, and offers a level of party customization that hasn't been experienced in the franchise prior. But what good is an amazing battle system without some truly awesome battles to test it? Returning from Final Fantasy IV is the ATB, or Active Time Battle system, which helps combat to feel more fluid than the NES era entries. Although Final Fantasy III and IV dabbled with the idea of having specific strategies in combat to do well, V really pushes the envelope here. The strategies required for some of the bosses remind me of Final Fantasy III. If you haven't been using a certain job prior to the encounter, you might back yourself up into a corner and be somewhat stuck. For instance, there's a portion of the game where your party splits up and one group has to proceed with only magic, while the other can use only physical attacks. Although you get to choose which members go to which path, this sudden change of strategy can catch the ill-prepared off guard. In this regard, the game's biggest strength could also prove to be its biggest weakness at times. Now, speaking of being ill-prepared, first-time players will more than likely find themselves woefully out of their league when they first encounter some of the game's franchise-defining challenges. While Final Fantasy V may not have been the first to introduce optional endgame content for acquiring summons like Leviathan or Bahamut, it does take things one step further. For the first time in the franchise history, V introduces what would colloquially be known as super bosses. Now you might be thinking, Dan, Warmech was a super boss and it was in the first Final Fantasy. And although you are correct that Warmech is in the game, I would not consider it to be a super boss, as the preparation required to beat it is nowhere near what Final Fantasy V would set the bar to. Take the appearance of Omega and Shinryu. These super bosses would not only test the mettle of your level, but the lobs of your jobs. I think every player who has accidentally opened the trap chest in the last dungeon, releasing the hellacious Shinryu, would immediately get tidal waved and their party sent to their watery graves. Both Omega and Shinryu would single-handedly create a new tradition that would reoccur several times throughout this franchise. Defeating Omega would reward the player with a literal badge of honor, an item called the, Omega Badge, which did absolutely nothing for the player in the game. It would just serve as digital bragging rights. Shinryu, however, would reward the player not only with the badge, the Dragon Seal, it would also bestow upon them the Ragnarok Sword, the strongest sword available in the game. Future entries would hide some of the most powerful equipment and abilities behind the ever-increasing power of the super boss. Musically, Uematsu does not miss a beat. Right off the bat, the main theme, Ahead on Our Way, immediately evokes a sense of exploration and, for lack of a better term, get up and go. The music in Final Fantasy V takes many of the compositional cues employed in Final Fantasy IV with its emotion and expands upon it. You have some incredibly heart-aching tracks like Lena's theme, Nostalgia, or Deception, but also some of the biggest sounding tracks to date. And I am of course talking about tracks like Clash on the Big Bridge or The Decisive Battle, which just feels absolutely massive with adrenaline pumping while trying to beat the final battle of the game. Picking a track to remix is definitely becoming increasingly difficult as we continue through this series, but a choice must be made. I chose to remix Beyond the Deep Blue Sea. For this game's track, I just love the, well, no pun intended, flow of the piece. I love how this track captures exactly what the player is doing and also has a sense of melancholy throughout. What can I say? I'm a sucker for sadness. So without further ado, here's a sample of Off the Deep End, which is available for Patreon supporters to download now. The reception of Final Fantasy V in Japan was extremely impressive, selling over 900,000 copies on the first day, and going on to sell over 2 million copies within the first 2 months. It became Japan's fourth multi-million seller, released in 1992, along with Street Fighter II, Super Mario Kart, and Dragon Quest V. By the end of the year, it would be the second best-selling game of the year, just behind Dragon Quest V. Something really interesting to me is that although the game proved with its sales numbers that it provided a great experience for the players, many of the reviews would not laud the game in as high regard. Check out this review from 1UP. While the game's story was very weak, the gameplay was another story, heavily praising the job system and the feature to combine abilities from different job classes, and gave the score a B-. Sometimes it really makes me think that they just got reviews from people who hate RPGs. I'm pretty sure RP Gamer's real review was, "This is the best RPG I've ever played. Too bad the genre can lick my ass. 5 out of 10. If Final Fantasy V is a 5 out of 10, then 90% or more of JRPGs must be lower than a 5. Get out of here with that nonsense. So does Final Fantasy V hold up today? Absolutely. It is a great game with a job system that allows for so much versatility that no 2 playthroughs will really play out the same. Whether you are playing the fan translation, anthologies, Pixel Remaster, or any of the other versions, it's still a fun game that is worth your time if you want a little bit of customization with a simple and straightforward narrative experience. My only critique of the different versions is that the anthology version on the PlayStation has quite a few load times, and if that annoys you, you may want to steer clear of that version in particular. Now, as with all of the titles 1 through 6, for these reviews I personally played through the Pixel Remaster versions, and I can safely say that it is a fun, polished experience. I would once again like to thank my Patreon supporters for making this series possible. A reminder, if you would like to be one of the named characters in these playthroughs, get any musical releases early before I publicly release them, or just wanting to further support the channel, consider becoming a patron. In the next video, we'll be covering the Final Fantasy game that really spawned my love for not only RPGs, but also what I personally consider the main reason that I got into music almost 30 years ago now. So until next time, my fellow freelancers, praise be to Yevon.